I don't think people understand how slowly a life can be dismantled until they watch it happen from the inside. Not with a single disaster, not with one dramatic act of cruelty, but piece by piece, quietly, while everyone else looks away. That was my father's final decade, and I was close enough to hear every small crack forming before the collapse. When my dad died on December 1st, 2022, the house felt unnaturally still, as if it finally knew it could exhale. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, accusing. It pressed against my chest in a way grief alone never does. Because grief assumes love went both ways. What my father lived through was something far uglier. For more than 15 years, his body betrayed him. Chronic illness is cruel like that. It doesn't arrive screaming. It whispers. It steals strength in inches, dignity in moments. At first he could still walk, still drive short distances, still insist he was fine. The man had worked his entire adult life to pay for that house. Every nail in the wall carried memory. Leaving it was never an option to him. That stubborn loyalty to the life he built would ultimately become the thing used against him. As his health declined, dependency crept in, and that's when my mother stepped fully into who she really was. She was never warm, never gentle. Even in my childhood, there was a hollowness to her that you learn not to question. But when my dad grew weaker, that hollowness turned predatory. She handled his medications, his appointments, his finances. On paper, she was a caregiver. In reality, she was a gatekeeper who controlled access to everything he needed to survive. She told people they were separated, sometimes divorced. The story changed depending on who was listening. She spent hours online talking to other men, laughing in a room where my father struggled to breathe. She openly spoke of moving away, marrying someone else, starting over, while still living under the roof he paid for, using money that came from his disability checks. I remember standing in the kitchen once, watching her tap away at her phone, while my dad sat slumped at the table, too weak to lift his coffee mug without shaking. The contrast burned into my mind. Carelessness on one side, quiet endurance on the other. Every time I visited, something felt wrong. A missed appointment, empty pill bottles, utilities overdue when there should have been plenty of money. I began tracking things mentally, then physically, because denial is a luxury victims can't afford. When I brought it up, she turned sweet in that thin, performative way manipulators master. She would sigh heavily, call herself overwhelmed, remind everyone how hard it was to be married to a sick man. Somehow, she was always the victim. Behind closed doors, my dad grew smaller, not just physically, but emotionally. He stopped complaining, stopped asking. When I pushed him to come live with me, begged him some nights through tears, he always shook his head. He told me he could handle it, told me he didn't want trouble, told me he didn't want to lose the house. I didn't realize then how deeply fear rooted itself inside him. Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing what little control he had left. We tried everything. Every legal route we could think of. Every phone call ended the same way. Civil matter. Nothing we can do. No immediate danger. You'd think exploitation had to look violent to matter. You'd think neglect needed bruises to be real. Each rejection felt like the system shrugging, while telling us to watch carefully as a man disappeared in slow motion. Eventually, my dad made a choice that told me he finally understood the stakes. He made me durable power of attorney. He added me to every account he could. Sitting beside him as he signed those papers, his hand shaking so badly he had to pause between letters. Something hardened inside me. It wasn't rage yet. It was resolve. A quiet acknowledgement that if I didn't step in fully, no one else would. I began seeing things more clearly then. The unexplained withdrawals. The way she discouraged him from eating certain foods because they were too expensive. The way she isolated him by telling relatives he didn't want visitors. The pattern wasn't messy. It was calculated. The worst part wasn't the abuse itself. It was watching him excuse it. Watching a once proud man lower his expectations for kindness until neglect felt normal. Until exploitation felt like the cost of having someone nearby. When his health took a sharp turn downward, everything accelerated. Hospital visits blurred together. Machines beeped steadily while my mother complained about parking fees and inconvenience. In those last weeks, I moved him in with me, finally forcing an outcome he had resisted for years. By then, it was too late to undo the damage. His body was exhausted. His mind was tired of fighting. He died quietly. No dramatic speeches. No final confrontations. Just a long breath out, and then nothing. At the funeral, she cried loudly. Too loudly. The kind of grief that demands an audience. People hugged her, told her how strong she'd been, how devoted. I stood a few feet away, hands clenched, watching a woman receive praise she had never earned. As I drove away that day, one thought kept repeating, steady and cold. This story wasn't finished. Because my father had survived 15 years of suffering, and someone was going to finally answer for it. Just not yet. I thought the worst part was going to be watching him die. I was wrong. The worst part came after, when I realized even in death, she was still trying to control him. The day after Thanksgiving, I brought my dad home on hospice. The house felt different the moment he crossed the threshold, quieter than usual, as if the walls understood this wasn't a temporary visit. I had spent nights preparing his room, adjusting lights, making sure everything smelled clean and familiar. I wanted his final days to be free from hospital beeping, free from strangers poking and prodding him. I wanted him to feel like a human being again, not a patient. He was so tired by then, bone deep tired. But when I helped him into bed, when I explained softly that he was home and he could rest, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Relief. His shoulders loosened. His breathing slowed. For the first time in a long while, no one was hurrying him, scolding him, or reminding him how inconvenient his existence had become to someone else. Those days passed both too fast and impossibly slow. I made sure he ate what he wanted, even if it was just a few bites. I played his favorite music, quietly in the evenings. Old songs that carried memories of road trips, weekends, a version of him that existed before sickness stole his strength. Sometimes he was lucid. Sometimes he drifted in and out, eyes half open, lips moving as if talking to someone I couldn't see. At night, when the house was dark and the world felt far away, he would grip my hand weakly and apologize for being a burden, for what I had been forced to witness, for not leaving sooner. Every time, I told him the truth, that he wasn't a burden, that loving him was easy, that none of this was his fault. I don't know how much of it reached him in the end, but I needed him to hear it. He passed quietly. No drama, no struggle, just a soft stillness that settled over the room, followed by a silence so profound it rang in my ears. I sat there longer than I probably should have, memorizing his face, the peace finally etched into his features. For the first time since his illness began, he looked free. I thought that would be the end of the battle. A day later, I sat across from the funeral director, going over arrangements. My dad had been very clear about what he wanted. He didn't want a burial. He wanted to be cremated. Simple, straightforward. A final decision he had made while he still could. I handed over paperwork calmly, feeling oddly grounded by the process. It felt like the last thing I could do for him. One final act of respect. Then the funeral director paused. He cleared his throat, glanced at the screen, then back at me with a sympathetic expression I would soon learn to dread. He explained gently that despite my father naming me durable power of attorney, despite my name being on accounts, despite everything, they still require my mother's consent for cremation. I remember the exact moment my chest tightened. It felt unreal, like a cruel joke. Even now, after everything, she still had a say. When I called her, my expectations were low, but she managed to sink beneath them effortlessly. She said no, flatly, no explanation, no hesitation, just no, as if denying his final wish was a power move she had been waiting to make. I could hear satisfaction hiding behind her tone. I tried reasoning. I reminded her it was what he wanted. I told her this wasn't about us. It was about honoring a dead man. She responded with cold indifference, said she needed time, said she'd think about it. The delay felt deliberate. Hours passed. Then a call came. Her voice was measured, careful. She said she would agree under one condition. She wanted assurance she could keep the Social Security survivor benefits. I nearly laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. Those benefits legally belonged to her anyway. There was never a universe where she wouldn't receive them. She knew that, or maybe she didn't. But what mattered was this. She was using my father's body as leverage for financial reassurance she didn't even need. I agreed, not because she beat me, not because I was weak, but because my dad deserved to have his wishes respected, even if the cost was swallowing my pride. I bit down hard on my anger and said the words she wanted to hear. She consented shortly afterward, as if granting me a favor. The funeral home proceeded. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. Something shifted in me then. Grief had already hollowed me out, but this was different. This was clarity, a sharp, quiet understanding that her cruelty wasn't situational. It wasn't stress. It wasn't confusion. It was intentional, consistent, and it wasn't over. Even in death, she had to remind me she still believed she held power. She couldn't see what I saw from that moment forward. That power used thoughtlessly leaves fingerprints, and fingerprints can be traced. As I signed the final paperwork, I realized something important. She thought this was her last move. She had no idea she'd just shown me exactly how she plays the game. And now, finally, I was paying attention. The obituary was supposed to be a formality, just a few paragraphs. Dates, facts, maybe a line about who he was outside of his illnesses. That's what people think an obituary is. Clean, neutral, polite. What they don't tell you is that it's also power. Quiet, permanent power. It's the last public version of a life. The version that gets printed, saved, searched, and remembered long after everyone else has stopped telling stories. I sat alone at my kitchen table when I wrote it. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft click of keys under my fingers. I remember staring at the blank screen for a long time before typing the first word, because once I started, there would be no undoing it. This wasn't about revenge yet. It was about truth, or at least my truth, and whether I had the courage to stand behind it. I wrote about his work ethic, how he had spent decades building something with his own hands. I wrote about his humor, dry and understated, the kind that caught you off guard if you weren't paying attention. I wrote about his love for simple things, quiet mornings, familiar routines. I acknowledged his illness without centering it. He had been so much more than what his body had become, and I refused to let his sickness be his defining feature. What I did not write was her name. Not once. Not indirectly. Not hidden behind polite language like survived by his wife or beloved husband. There was no acknowledgement of marriage. No mention of a spouse. If someone read that obituary without context, they would assume he lived his life as an individual, a man defined by his own efforts, his children, and the legacy he left behind. I didn't do it impulsively. I weighed the consequences carefully. I knew exactly what it would look like. I knew people would notice. But recognition is earned, and I couldn't bring myself to grant her a title she had spent years undermining. A grieving widow implies care, devotion, partnership. None of those words belonged to her. Not in life, and certainly not in death. When I submitted it, my hand didn't shake. If anything, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like a small, precise click inside my mind as something aligned. The reaction came faster than I expected. She called me first, screaming, not crying, furious, the kind of anger that strips away any attempt at civility. She accused me of erasing her, of humiliating her publicly, of being vindictive and cruel. I listened in silence as she spiraled, her words looping over themselves, outrage compounding into hysteria. At one point she shouted that I was trying to rewrite history. I almost told her she had misunderstood. I wasn't rewriting anything. I was editing. Then came the questions. From family members who hadn't been close enough to see the cracks. From friends who remembered them as a couple from years ago, before illness changed the dynamics, before neglect became routine. Their messages were cautious, confused. Why wasn't she mentioned? Was this an oversight? A mistake? Every question forced a choice. I could soften it, smooth it over, offer vague explanations. Or I could let the discomfort exist. I chose the latter. I didn't broadcast accusations. I didn't beg for validation. I simply said there were reasons, and that the obituary reflected the reality of his life as I had lived alongside him. What surprised me most was how many people quietly understood without needing details. How many said nothing at all, but shifted their behavior subtly. Invitations were extended to me, not her. Condolences came my way, accompanied by knowing looks, lowered voices, words like, "That must have been difficult," spoken with a weight they hadn't carried before. She, on the other hand, unraveled. She demanded corrections, threatened to call the funeral home, the newspaper, anyone who would listen. When she realized nothing could be changed without my approval, her anger sharpened into something colder. She began calling relatives to tell her side of the story, painting herself as the victim of a spiteful child, a grieving spouse robbed of her dignity. But already, the seed had been planted. People started noticing patterns they had ignored for years. How she spoke about him, how she spoke about herself, how quickly her outrage shifted toward money, appearances, entitlement. The absence of her name in that obituary did something I hadn't anticipated. It created space. Space for people to question a narrative they had accepted by default. I didn't celebrate that realization. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was relief. For the first time, the story wasn't being managed by her. It wasn't wrapped in excuses or forced sympathy. It was quiet, sparse, honest. The obituary ran exactly as I wrote it. Printed, shared, archived. She knew she couldn't remove it, couldn't edit it, couldn't insert herself where she believed she belonged. And that loss of control terrified her far more than grief ever could. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't just about a single slight or public omission. It was about visibility, about who gets seen and who doesn't. By refusing to acknowledge her in print, I had done more than hurt her pride. I had stripped her of a role she had relied on to excuse everything else. She wasn't a widow in that story. She was a footnote she couldn't force onto the page. And as the days passed, as whispers grew louder and questions multiplied, I could feel the shift, the subtle beginning of consequences, a tightening circle around her carefully constructed image. She was still angry, still loud, but for the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. And she knew it. There's a point, somewhere deep into survival, when silence stops feeling like strength and starts feeling like complicity. It took me years, therapy, and my father's death to finally understand that difference. I didn't wake up one morning eager to expose her. I didn't plan some public reckoning. What I did was tell the truth when asked. And that was enough to destroy everything she had spent decades constructing. Therapy peeled things back slowly. Session by session, memory by memory. My therapist used words I had avoided for most of my life. Narcissistic abuse, emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, coercive control. At first, hearing them felt dramatic, almost wrong, like I was exaggerating something ordinary. But the more we unpacked the past, the clearer it became. This wasn't normal dysfunction. This was a pattern. One that didn't start with my father's illness and didn't end with his death. She controlled the narrative by controlling reactions. Any challenge to her behavior was met with tears, outrage, or silent punishment. Growing up, I learned quickly that peace came from compliance and chaos followed honesty. That lesson stayed with me far longer than it should have. After my dad died, people began asking questions. Quiet ones at first. Friends wondering why she seemed less devastated than expected. Family members confused by her shifting stories. Then bolder ones. Why hadn't she been more involved at the end? Why did finances seem tangled? Why did things feel off? And every time, I took a breath and told the truth. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke calmly, factually, the way therapists help you do when you're done protecting other people's secrets. I talked about years of neglect, about financial abuse, about isolation, about watching my father apologize for existing while the person meant to care for him treated his illness as an inconvenience. I talked about how I tried to intervene, how the system failed him, how silence was never mistaken for consent, only exhaustion. Some people recoiled. Others stared at me as if a puzzle had finally snapped into place. A few accused me outright of being cruel, of tarnishing a grieving widow's reputation, of airing dirty laundry that should have stayed hidden. I accepted that, because I knew something they didn't. If she didn't want her actions discussed, she shouldn't have done them. That realization was oddly freeing. I wasn't responsible for maintaining the image she curated. I wasn't obligated to uphold a lie just because it was comfortable for others. The truth didn't need aggression to survive. It just needed daylight. Her reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Rage disguised as heartbreak. Extended performances of victimhood. Accusations that I had turned everyone against her. That I was manipulative. That I was cruel beyond measure. Watching her scramble felt surreal, like observing a stage actor forget their lines once the spotlight shifted. But something important had changed. People weren't responding the way they used to. Sympathy was thinner, questions sharper. Her stories met with pause instead of immediate validation. The public image she relied on began to crack, not because I attacked it, but because it couldn't withstand scrutiny. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. For years, she built herself a role as the long-suffering wife, the martyr, the unsung hero burdened by everyone else's needs. That role protected her, excused her, and allowed her to siphon empathy endlessly. When that image collapsed, so did her primary source of control. And yes, in some versions of the story, I am the villain. I am the child who spoke out, the one who refused to stay quiet, the one who chose honesty over harmony. I've been called bitter, dramatic, heartless. I've been told I should have taken the high road, let it go, moved on. But here's the truth no one likes to confront. Moving on doesn't require silence, and healing doesn't demand forgiveness on someone else's timeline. I didn't do this for revenge in the way people imagine it. There was no shouting, no public spectacle, no explosive confrontation. The revenge, if you want to call it that, was simple. I stopped lying for her. I stopped making myself smaller so she could keep pretending. That was enough. My father never got justice in a courtroom. He never got an apology. He never got to see her face consequences in any formal sense. But in the end, his story wasn't swallowed by hers. His suffering wasn't buried under a false narrative of devotion. He was finally seen, and I would do it again. Every time, without hesitation, because silence protected her for years, and truth set both of us free. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose truth over family harmony, you're not alone. Like the video if it helped you feel seen. Share it with someone who might need the courage to stop staying silent. And if you want more real, slow burn stories like this, subscribe.